There we are. Good morning, my friends. Well, it's Sunday afternoon, but it sure feels like morning because we just did the time change thing. And even though I mentioned it last night during the Wicked Party, I still forgot to reset my watch this morning and ended up having to scramble, thinking I had another hour to go. But here we are. We've managed to get it all together, and we're ready to talk about brains and music and a peek behind the curtain and all the things that you like about DJing because it's time for Musically Minded. We've got the coffee going. Good to see you all. DJ Frantic in the chat there. Of course, if you've got any questions, do throw them up in the chat and we'll get to them at some point. I want to continue with where we sort of left off last week. We spent episode 12 talking all about the marvelous machine that is the Technics 1200 Mark II. And, well, you know, we went over the hour and we still weren't done. And so today what I want to do is talk about some of the things that you should look for when you're buying one of these machines. Obviously, there is the new version of the Technics 1200. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the classics. So we're going to take a look at those and some of the things that you should be looking for when you're buying the classic machines. Before we do that, of course, we've got DJD42, your hostess assist with the most assist, Diana, co-hosting with me, trying to keep her eyes open, co-hosting with me today. And she, of course, will let you know all the good things that are going on in the chat room and such. But while we've got her here, let's get her on the microphone. Diana, would you kindly update us on all the good things that are coming up?
Good morning. Well, this Wednesday on MTV TV, we have New Music O'Clock hosted by Hanging Raven. On Saturday, the 18th, we have We Drink and We Spin Spooky Things right here on Addambomb's channel at 8 p.m. Eastern. And of course, every Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern, we have Musically Minded.
Oh, there we are. Okay, I do have the microphone on. I thought I turned it off. Okay, everything's working. Thank you, Diana. And yeah, and tonight we're actually heading into Boston for a sort of a secret show, Charming Disaster, tonight. So as soon as we get off the air here, we're going to be getting ourselves on the road pretty shortly thereafter. I am recording. I remembered. How about that? All right, so let's go ahead and get into the turntable talk. As I said, if you've got questions, throw them up in the chat here. I do want to talk about some of the things that you should be keeping an eye out for when you're buying one of these marvelous machines. The first thing I want to get to there, I'm gonna reiterate a little bit from last week. So the first thing I'm going to get to is that bit about the platter magnet. You want to make sure that the magnet under the platter there doesn't have any cracks or chips in it and that kind of thing. That's a very important part of the puzzle. And when you look inside too, you want to make sure that you don't have a shit ton of corrosion or anything. Like a little bit is acceptable. You want to make sure that the spindle turns. That the motor doesn't actually turn the spindle, but it does turn when the platter's on it. It's like, well, the motor turns the spindle because the platter's on it. So pretty cool. Get this back on properly here. I have to do it from above. There we go. So yeah, make sure that magnet looks good. Make sure the electronics, the motor in there looks pretty good. And you don't have to take the whole thing apart to do it. You just pop the platter off and give it a look. A few other things that you're going to want to look for. What should I do first? Should I plug it in? So yeah, we're talking about the platter. So let me plug it in. I can't reach the plug. There we go. Okay, we have power. So this is a cool thing about the platter here. So you'll see it has this dot pattern around it, and that's actually a really important. How would you say? It's a measuring device, really, and it's a really important part of the turntable. So let me see if I can turn that a bit for the camera here. So when you have the power on, this little light comes on here. Back it up. This little light comes on here under the power switch, right? It's this red light, and you see the dots going around. And when it's centered, when it's in quartz lock and at 33, you will see that the big dot in the sort of middle of the platter there, it has the appearance of not moving. It looks like it's standing steady there, and the ones above it and below it look like they're sliding sort of in different directions. But the one in the middle is a nice solid, hello Labyrinth, is a nice solid looking circle. And that tells you that the platter is in fact running at 33 and a third RPMs. If you've got it in quartz lock and set at 33, that dot should be stable. If it's not, then the turntable needs adjustments. You're going to have a mechanic do that for you, because it means that either the pitch fader needs to be replaced or fixed, or that the motor itself needs to be tuned, which is a fair job. The other thing about these dots, and this is another thing that you should check when you're buying a turntable, is that when you slide it to -4 on your pitch adjustment, suddenly the small dots below the middle dot, they go stable, and the middle dot goes sliding around. And that is what that is for. That is a measurement to tell you that that is -4 and that you are actually at -4. Then, of course, the one above that, the next row up there, that one tells you that, well, I guess it's actually 3.3%. That's what it tells you. It's not 4%. It's 3.3%. So it's a little under 4%. That tells you that measurement. And then, of course, the next measurement up is your 6 up. So the next set of dots up. So you have -3.3 percent, 33 and a third in the center there, quartz lock, plus 3.3 and plus 6. And so that's a good way to test to see if the pitch fader is working on the Technics 1200 that you're looking to buy. If it is a classic Mark II, it will click in the center. Unless it has been modified, you can modify these and remove the click, or put in a pitch fader from a later model. The Model 3s and through 5s, they don't have the click. But if it's a Mark II, it ought to click in the middle, like I said, unless it's been modified. Of course, if it's been modified, it might have a little more value, because that means that a mechanic has had a hold of it and probably done some of the other mods that we talked about last week. You know, putting in the RCA jacks and that kind of stuff. That makes your machine actually a little more valuable, especially if you know that it's in good tune, by watching the little dots on the side of the platter. The dots on the platter go round and round. How about that? Beautiful stuff. Another thing that you're going to want to check is your cueing light. So this little pop-up light here, it's on the button and it pops up on a spring. Real cool. What that does is it sends a little beam of light right across the top of your record, so that you can see the grooves in your record. And not as important for DVS, but when you're playing actual vinyl, that's how you see where the songs begin and end, because you can see the distance between the tracks that way. And it's how you do your cueing, right? That's what it's there for. It's a cueing light. So you want to make sure that works. Again, that's something that can be replaced, and you can mod it. You can put in, cool colored lights and that kind of stuff if you wish. But it's a job. You have to take the whole bottom of the thing off and get into the circuit boards, take this whole thing out to do it. It's that stupid little lamp. And this is one of the first things too that'll go on the machine is the lamp will burn out, and it is actually a real pain in the butt to replace. So a lot of times you will find the machines where the lamp is burned out. Again, that's something that you're going to need to have a mechanic do unless you're really, really good with tools and following, instructions on YouTube or something. I'm sure there's a YouTube out there for that. All right, so let's see. Moving right along. And look at that. I mean, we're chewing up time already. It was like we haven't even gotten off the platter yet. Yeah, so we're going to try to run through all this and then get to any other questions that are up there. And I do see that we have something from Frantic, and I will totally get to that. Mm-hmm. We're actually going to talk a bit too about Frantic's got a question about CDJs, but we're also going to talk about some of the other turntables on the market, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So moving right along. So we've talked about the platter, we've talked about the pitch fader, we've talked about making sure all your little lights work. As far as little lights go, there aren't a hell of a lot of them. The power light itself, right, which again is the indicator of the speed using the dots on the platter. You want to make sure that your 45 and 33 LEDs light up. You want to make sure that your pop-up queuing light lights up. You want to make sure that your center pitch LED lights up. Again, you can change all the colors on these things. Like I did one for DJ Redshift, all blue. I did one for Jason too. Yeah, but yeah. So a lot of fun to do those, and they look really cool when you do that. There's one of the cool mods that's out there is a underlit platter, so you can see the lighting around the rim and stuff. That's a neat one. That's a time-consuming mod, but it's a really neat one. I actually haven't had the privilege of doing one of those. That's something that I haven't had the. It's like I don't really want it for myself, but somebody I know at some point is going to want one, right? Yeah. Mods, man, there are some really cool mods out there. In fact, there's a MIDI mod out there that some guy in France invented. I mean, we're talking, this is when you're like deep into the otaku of turntable modding, by the way. You start to find these really interesting things like, full throw 100% pitch fader mod mode, so that you can go between like 25, 50, 100% pitch fader instead of just being locked into the 8. So you can do more kind of like boom kind of things and like more tone play kind of stuff. Like DJ Woody, by the way, to talk about working on the pitch fader and doing tone play, DJ Woody is a master of that. And was it Vestax that made the MIDI turntable? There was one of them that made a MIDI turntable. I think Reloop has one. And that's pretty cool because it's got a MIDI bank, like button bank that you can use to actually change the speed of the platter and change the pitch of the sample that you're playing. So that's pretty neat. But yeah, so getting back into the basics though. Like chain me to the ground here before I start talking about more weird modifications. Last week I mentioned that you should have one of these multimeters in your turntable toolkit, and that's another thing that you want to check. We talked last week about doing a continuity check, right? So testing between the tone arm and the output for the 4 points, and the 4 points on the jacks, right? Or on the plugs rather, and how to do that. Of course, the way to do it is to set it to the beepy one, and it'll beep when if the signal goes all the way through, it'll beep. It's really easy, but it can save you a lot of grief. Because if you buy a turntable and you haven't done that continuity check, you know, you might end up having to get down into the bottom of the thing and figure out where losing its signal, which would be that little, probably that little PC board that I showed you last week, where all the wires from the tone arm connect to the output and everything. So if you're not getting continuity between the contacts in the tone arm and the contacts on the plugs, that means that there's something in there that needs some soldering. And as I've mentioned before, it's a lot of screws. So, you know, and when you're buying these machines, like, all of these little things affect the price, you know, like, okay, and we're going to get to the tone arm in a second, which I told you last week. It's like, you know, a number of years ago, I did a tone arm replacement on a turntable, and the fucking tone arm itself, just the tone arm assembly, was like $175, and I'm sure by now that they're probably even more expensive than that as they become rarer, and harder to find, you know. So in a moment here, we're going to talk about the tone arm and what to look for, how to balance it, what to look for when you're buying a used turntable. And this is going to be useful no matter what turntables you're using, because balancing a tone arm is balancing a tone arm, but then I'm going to show you why it matters when you're buying a used one. Yeah, pretty cool, right? All right, so let's go ahead and put the head shell into the tone arm here. And that just gently screws on. You just tighten it, you know, to finger tight. You want it to be easy to unscrew again. You don't beast mode the thing on there. You want the contacts to touch. You don't want to crush them back into the tone arm. All right, and then we put the we've got this weight on here, and it's got a little dial around it there with some numbers on it, and I'm going to show you what that means in a moment. So we're going to put that on the back of the tone arm, and it just kind of wheels its way in there and clicks. Bam, there's the click. All right, so right now it's not going to be balanced, right? Like, okay, look at that. See, it's like it's hanging. Well, actually, that's pretty good. This is actually about where I want the balance of the tone arm to be when I'm shopping a turntable. Is I want it to be floating off of the rest. This is the armrest. You want it to float above the rest, but not too far, right? Because you want to make sure that it's bouncing back and forth. And when you have your anti-skate set at 0, it's going to return to that position. And then when you turn the anti-skate, you see, like, all of a sudden it swings all the way back over. Yeah, like I've cranked the anti-skate dial all the way over to 3, and now the needle, like the tone arm, just wants to peg itself up against the armrest. And when I have it on 0, it just wants to float free, right? Just like that. And that is a sign of a good tone arm, right? Is that it just kind of floats and bobbles there. And then when you turn the anti-skate, it just wants to go all the way over. And so you know that's a good, the balance of the, you know, the tone arm itself is a good tone arm. The bearings are good, and that's why I told you not to touch that little screw in the top up there. There's a little bearing. It's like a little triangular screw kind of, and if you tighten it down, it stops the bearing. And you'll never get it quite right again. It'll forever either be sloppy or too tight. And you want that perfect float, and that's beautiful. So now what I'm going to do, since I know that that's my good floating spot here, I'm going to set it back in the armrest, and I'm going to set this little outside dial here. There's a little mark on the top here. I'm going to set the outside dial to 0 there. And that's my 0 position, my nicely floating tone arm. It's not falling all the way back onto the weight. It's not falling all the way forward. So that's my 0 point. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial the whole thing, not just the dial, not just the number dial. I'm going to dial the whole thing down to the weight that I want for my head shell. A little over 2.5 grams. I should grab a record. There we go. all marked up, right? I didn't mention this, by the way, last week, but that tape is on the bottom. Because I'm using clears, I put the tape across the bottom, and then that way the top of the disc is completely free. It's not going to like tick, 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 tick over the needle. I realized after the show last week, I was like, yeah, I probably should have mentioned that. All right, but now that I've got the make sure the little tabs up there, the needle protector is up. But now that I've got the oops, I don't have it quite where I want it there yet, do I? Oh, I see. I didn't have the weight on all the way. How about that? You got me. I didn't have the weight on all the way. So let me dial it back again and get it back to right. So, like, this is what you do when you didn't do it right in the first place. Dial that weight back. Where do you want to be? Where do you want to be, weight? There, that's where it wants to be. All right, and I get my 0 there, and then when you spin it, it should screw itself forward, and that's what it wasn't doing. I didn't have it on quite right. So if it's not screwing on quite right, then it means it's not sitting on it quite right. So now I've got about 3.5 grams of pressure coming forward. It's that's what this is talking about. This is 3.5 grams. So I've gone from the 0 mark where I had it floating to now dialing it forward on the thing, so it's applying 3.5 grams of pressure, which is about what you'd want for your Technics head shell with your 44/7 needle and cartridge on it. Of course, some of the different needles you're going to use different weights, and then from there it's a matter of preference. Like if you find that when you're handling the records, it's being a little jumpy or whatever, you can add a little more weight. It's usually better to have to use as little weight as possible to keep from damaging your records, obviously. One of the things that used to see in clubs a lot, like, would be taping a penny or a nickel to the head shell to keep the weight down. So you'd have the thing cranked all the way forward and a penny or a nickel on the head shell, because the subwoofers were under the DJ booth or something. Highly not recommended. I say highly not recommended, because you're basically just forcing the needle down into the record and cutting away at the record while you're doing it. Your records won't last as long if you do that. Again, maybe not such a big deal if you're using control vinyl, but hey, it works better if you keep it clean and you're getting a good signal from it. So yeah, you don't want to grind away all the plastic. That's another anti-skate thing too. For the most part, when we're DJing, you shouldn't need to change the anti-skate from 0. It ought to work just fine. And especially if you're doing juggling and stuff like that, you don't want the back pressure on the needle. The anti-skate is going to make it push to the outside. And so what you really want is that good locked in needle. Now, how do you get that needle good and locked in? That's going to be the next question, isn't it? So now you've got a good tone arm, you've got a good motor. Actually, there's one other thing that I should talk about the motor, but I'll get to that in a moment. No, I'm going to do that first, because why not? Anticipation. So when you're buying a turntable, you want to look at the motor. You take everything off, so you're just looking at the platter, and you want to run that platter, and you want to get your eyes level with the base of the unit, so that you're watching the platter, and you want to make sure it runs flat and doesn't wobble or have a raise in it, because if it does, that probably means that there's something wrong with the spindle. Either the spindle is bent a little bit, which can happen if they get dropped, or that perhaps there's a bunch of ball bearings that are under the spindle. There's a little ball bearing set, and one of those bearings could be damaged or floating around somewhere in the bottom of your turntable. And that would cause the spindle to wobble. So you want to make sure that that the platter is not wobbling, it's not shaking back and forth. It ought to be just real nice and flat and just like super clean and almost noiseless. It's like, can you hear that? No. It's right under the microphone. You can't hear it. It's so noiseless. If it has like a grindy sound or something when you turn on the motor, that probably means it was at Burning Man. There's sand in there or some shit. And you don't want that because it'll just grind away those bearings that I was talking about, and then it'll make the platter move erratically or wobble. And of course, you're getting pretty fine-tuned there, but the thing that you have to remember is that these are the machines that you're making your living on, right? And so anything that affects the performance of the machine could affect your performance as a DJ. So moving right along, what's this that I have? This little scrap of paper, this incredibly important scrap of paper in my hand. This is a little gauge, and I just printed it out off the internet. What the hell is it called? There's a few of these different kind of gauges, and what they're for is for measuring the distance between your spindle and where your needle lays on the record, and you're doing it from two positions. That's why there's two holes in there that I've cut out to fit over the spindle. There are a couple of these different gauges, but what you do is you put the gauge down on there, you put the spindle, through the hole, put the spindle in the hole, baby. I'm going to re-engage my needle protector here, and you want to measure that so that there's this little box down here, right? And that's all little 90-degree markings that we're using. So what we're doing is we're gauging that the front of the needle cartridge, that the needle itself is landing on this center line, and that the front of the needle cartridge is parallel with these little blocks, these little boxes in there. And we're going to test that on a couple of different positions on the record. We're going to test it at this position, and then we're going to test it further towards the middle of the record there. And then that way we know that our cartridge is properly mounted in the head shell, and that it's getting the most possible contact to both sides of the groove in the record through the main part of the platter. And that's a very important little gauge. Did you find it? Oh, you've got the anti-skating thing there. I thought Diana was perhaps looking up the gauge for this, and I can't remember what it's called.
I'm looking that up right now, actually.
There you go. Yeah, because she's good at that kind of stuff. Your mic is live, by the way. I didn't know if you know.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, these handy dandy little gauges. That's how you make sure that your cartridge is set up, and from there you ought to know. Now that you've done all these little things, you ought to know if you've got a good working turntable on your hands, or if you have a turntable that needs work. And that, of course, is going to affect the value, because if you've got a bad tone arm, that's going to be an expensive job. The part's expensive, and the labor is going to be expensive because it takes a long time and it's fiddly, picky-uni work, right? So my theory on this is like I said last week, I'm the kind of person that'll buy a turntable that's in pretty shit shape motor wise, but has a great tone arm on it, because if I can get it for a price that makes those parts worthwhile. Currently I don't actually have any parts machines, because after my spine collapsed there, it's a bit harder for me to work on turntables. Actually, here's another thing real quick too. When you are working on turntables, so originally these things came with a plastic top, And I don't actually have the plastic tops for all of my turntables, but I do have a couple of them that I keep around literally for the purpose of working on machines, so that I can put the plastic top on it and flip it all over. You know, you lock the tone arm in, and to be honest, if I'm working on a machine, if I'm transporting a machine, here's a thing too. If you're transporting the machine, take everything off the tone arm. Don't transport it with the needle on it. Don't transport it with the fucking weight on it. Don't transport it with the fucking weight on it. That's probably the number one thing that fucks up tone arms. The number two thing is dropping them, or dropping something on them, or fucking with that little fucking screw. Don't touch the fucking screw. Have I made that clear enough? Probably. All right. Diana, what do we have that's next on the agenda here? Oh yeah, the thing that I was saying about the lid is I use a twist tie like from Red or whatever to hold the tone arm down when I'm working on a turntable. It's like you take everything off, you take the motor off, well the platter, and you put the plastic top on it, and then you flip it over before you remove the feet and the bottom screws. But you want to make sure that tone arm is like tied in so that it doesn't go clunk, and potentially damage it. When you are looking at turntables, I cannot stress enough how important that tone arm is, because it is such an expensive and challenging part to replace. Like, if the motor is pretty good, but you have a cracked magnet, you can always get another platter and just slap another platter on, and that's probably going to be like $70 or whatever. It's not cheap, but like, it's an easy job to do, whereas the tone arm is a fiddly fucking job with soldering. And this is another thing too. Always ask for pictures before anybody works on your turntable. You want to see what their soldering looks like. I am super particular about my soldering. I grew up with my mother, who is a jeweler and made stained glass, for fuck's sake. So soldering, perfect soldering is like deeply ingrained in me. And I've taken apart turntables and seen some really chunky, awful soldering. And it's like, well, your problem is actually that the person who fixed your turntable did such a bad job of the soldering that it is now contacting it's there's a spark gap because of the big chunks of solder that will fuck up your turntable. I can answer that question for you in just a moment, Frantic. And I will get to the question about CDJs in a moment as well. Have I covered everything on this, Diana? Do you feel like now? Actually, I should ask everybody out in chat. Do you feel like now, and Diana, that you could go out and buy a Technics 1200 Mark II, 3, 4, whatever, with a degree of confidence that you would be getting a good machine for the price? I hope everybody does feel that way.
I do.
Of course, one of these machines in good working order can run you over, $600-700. I probably wouldn't part with my machines for under. I don't think I would part with my machines, period. But I would definitely charge the premium price for them, because I know everything about their condition and what I've done to them and all that kind of stuff. So I know if somebody's buying a turntable from me, they're getting a fucking mint piece of gear that does absolutely everything that's expected of it, and will for many, 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 many years to come. Becca J. Flower, hey, thanks for joining us. There are obviously a lot of other turntables on the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go into what you call it, Guitar Center or whatever, and Guitar Center. You go into Guitar Center or whatever, and you see the, or you go on Sweetwater, and you see all kinds of turntables out there at a pretty wide price, in pretty wide price brackets. Like, to be perfectly honest with you, buying a classic Technics probably won't cost you as much as buying one of those reloops that have the MIDI control and all that, that can connect to this software. It's definitely less expensive than buying a Denon professional DJ turntable, and it's less expensive than buying the higher end Pioneer models.
Okay.
Because most of those run over 800 or over even $1,000. I mean, like the Denon one is like $1,500. I think the top end Pioneer is somewhere around there as well. The Reloop is a little under that. So, but you'll find stuff like, you know, the Stanton, what is it, the Stanton 100s or whatever they are, and you know they're $200 ish, right? And that's a pretty good little machine. But usually the less expensive machines are going to be belt drives, right? Of course, the thing about belts is that they're not as accurate. Belts do stretch over time. And they're definitely not as good for like back cueing and scratching and that kind of thing. They're fine for playing records, you know, when you're when you're listening to records. Becca J. Flower says it's bizarre you can see record players at bookstores now. Yes, so all those guys are going to be, you know, belt drives for the most part. I know the type that you're talking about. There's a handful of brands, and I myself, as I've mentioned before, I am kind of nuts for portables. I love portable record players, but especially the portable record players that are made for scratching, you know, for portablism, where it has the crossfaders and stuff kind of built in it, and we do the modifications on those to make them even better.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of nuts for those. Of course, that's because I had, you know, one of those record players in a suitcase when I was a kid. It was basically just a plastic piece of crap, but I listened to hundreds of records on the thing.
Same.
And that's the kind of thing that you'd find at like the bookstores or like, you know, Newberry Comics or something like that. You know, like, you know, some pretty nice, you know, turntables for the money for like your home listening kind of thing. You know, you don't need a tank to listen, you know, is what we'd call a bookshelf system. You don't need a tank that, you know, just to listen to records. You need a tank if you're going on the road, and if you're manipulating the records, you know, if you're doing the scratching, the turntablism and that kind of stuff where you're on the platter a lot. Then you need platters that are going to keep rolling under you, and the belt drives are not. Like those things, if you touch it, it stops. You know what I mean? And also the needles on those, like don't go backwards, don't back cue with those kind of needles. That's something I should talk about real quick, is the shape of the needles. So like this matters a lot, DJs. This matters a lot. Make sure you know what the shape of your needle is. If you're going to be doing back cueing and scratching, it should be a cone, right? On some of the high-end needles that you'll find for like the pro club DJing and stuff, they have a little bit of a hook to it. And the reason it has that hook is to get more contact in the groove. But if you back cue with that, it's going into the record. So that's not a needle that you scratch with. It is there to get more contact in the groove for fidelity purposes. You know, you'll see Ortofon Pros or whatever, like, you know, it's like make sure that if you're getting needle, like that the needles that you're getting are suited to the purpose of your DJing. Like, you know, if you're not doing back cueing, you're not doing scratching and stuff, and you're looking for high fidelity, for mixing your 12 inches or whatever, the ones with the little hook, they get more contact, so you get better sound out of the record, better sound. With the spherical needles, that's what you want for your back cueing and scratching. And most of the ones that you find out there in the pro DJ world are going to be that shape, but definitely make sure you know, so that you're not causing more damage. Because, you know, if you back cue on those, on the ones that have the little hook shape, if you back cue with those, you're damaging the needle and the record at the same time. And so, you know, make sure the needle is suited to the purpose. And the needles on those home system kind of things, they're definitely not suited for the purpose of back cueing and stuff. If you need to go back to the beginning of the record, lift it, put it on the lead in, Like, don't fuck with back queuing on those.
Frantic does have a question along those lines.
What is that question?
That question is, how often do you need to change the needles on a turntable?
I'm going to say that's one of those things that is not really going to be determined by time, because if you don't use it much, or if you're not doing a lot of back queuing and scratching, you're not going to need to change it as often. Like if mostly what you're doing is playing records and mixing records, not back queuing, not scratching, your needles are going to last a lot longer. That said, it has a lot to do with the quality of the needle too. Like these, part of the reason that the M44-7s became so popular is because A, they have a very strong magnet in them, so you get really good fat boomy sound. B, they last. And they stand an awful lot of abuse. Like you can go hardcore battle style on these things for like weeks on end and not change them. What a lot of DJs do, and I'm guilty of this too, is I have a few different sets of needles. So if I'm going out and doing a gig, like if I go out and do a drum and bass night where like my entire job is just to be there with my one turntable and my mixer and do freestyle off fresh fucking scratching while the other DJ is playing, I want to use my fucking freshest needles, right? So that I'm getting really great contact, really great sound. And then when I'm practicing, I use my older needles. You know what I mean? The ones that are more worn. That said, when you first get your needles, this is a good trick for you, especially this type of needle. I wouldn't worry about it so much with the orthophones, but with these needles, when we first install a new needle, a lot of us scratch DJs, we break in the needle, and so basically what you do is you put it in and you put it on a record and you let it spin all the way through the record, and then you do it a few times. You let it like spin through a few hours of time on a record, just to get the flexibility in that. It's a tiny little sliver of metal. It's like a little spring. And if it's when you first buy them, it's kind of stiff, so you burn in the needle a little bit, to give it that little bit more flexibility for when you're back queuing and stuff, so it doesn't jump out of the grooves. And that's an important part of the balance too. When you're balancing the turntable, is like you don't want it to jump out of the grooves when you're back queuing. You got to roll it back 5 or 6 times to get to the beginning of your sample, or if you're scratching, you don't want it to bounce out. And that's what all that balancing does for you, and using the little gauge there and all that to make sure that your head shell is properly set up so that it doesn't do that. And like I said, then you should never really have to fuck with the anti-skate. And yes, Becca, like I said, it was my mom that beat good soldering into me. She made the jewelry, she made the stained glass stuff, and very very meticulous. We're very meticulous about soldering in my family. We really are. It is one of those things that it's a very important basic skill for electronics and jewelry and that kind of stuff. It's just skill layering really is like, if you're good at one, you can probably handle the other. You just adapt to the particular specs of what you're working on. So I did want to talk real quick about other turntables on the market, beyond just their pricing. And then we were going to answer the question about CDJs, right? And is that what we've got on the agenda?
There's 2 questions. I don't know if you want to just talk about the other turntables, and we'll get to the questions.
Well, let's do that real quick, because one of the things that is great about these machines is this motor system, right? That we've been talking about, how the platter itself is part of the motor, and that's why it runs so perfectly flat and so quiet and all that. Not all turntables have, like, direct drive there's kind of two different kinds of direct drive turntables. There's direct drive where the motor itself is part of the turntable, and then there's direct drive, which is a motor upon which the platter is mounted. It's like a spindle motor. Like it's a motor and the spindle turns and it moves the platter. Whereas in this case, the spindle itself is free. It moves with the platter. It's not moving the platter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we can do those tricks where we, I mean, as you can see, I'm pinching the spindle and it's moving the platter, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I can pop the platter right off and the spindle's still standing there. On a lot of the models out there, some of the lower ended direct drives and even some of the higher ended direct drives like the reloops and the pioneers even, they use motors that are made by a Chinese company called Hanpin, Hanpin, which if you want to look up, I'm sure Diana can find something about Hanpins on the internet there. So a lot of the turntables that you see out there are boxes that are built by the manufacturer to hold motors that are manufactured by Hanpin. So the thing about Hanpin, one of the turntables that's on the market is made by Audio Technica. It's what the LP120, I believe. And it is basically a Technics 1200 clone. It looks like a Technics. It acts like a Technics. It weighs the same as a Technics, which is heavy. And but it does have a spindle-driven platter. It has a handpin motor in it. It is not, the platter is not, the magnet is not part of the platter. And so when you look at those machines and you look at them edge on, like I said, with the Tech, it should run perfectly flat. With the handpin motors, you can see it go up and down just a little bit on every revolution because it's it's a screw. So it goes up and down a little bit as it goes around, as it goes up and down a little bit. So you'll see the platter up and down just a touch, which is not really that big of a deal, but the pickier the pickier you need to be, the pickier you get, I suppose. The pickier you need to be, the pickier you get. And of course those motors, they're brush motors. They're not going to last as long as like a brushless motor, as nothing contacts in these machines. I think that's a really important thing. There is no contact. The motor there's no contact between the motor and the platter here at all. It is literally, the platter is part of the motor. The only thing that contacts is the spindle, and that's actually contacting the bottom of the case. It's not touching the motor in any way. The spindle does not move if you take off the platter and turn on the motor. And that is a difference between those types of motors, the handpin motors, and motors that are built in this way. So Denon, I think Denon makes the most impressive modern turntable. It's like they went back all the way back to the drawing board and created a whole new magnet-driven engine for their turntables. They are quite expensive, but hot damn, they're nice.
Mm-hmm.
Moving right along to CDJs. Since we've got about 10 minutes left of the show today, of course, if anybody's got any more questions about the turntables, look at you, Diana, with the handpin links. If you have any questions about the turntables or whatever, go ahead, throw them up in the chat. You can always ask me on Patreon, of course, patreon.com or whatever /Addambombb, ADDAMBOMBB. Spell it right. You'll find me anywhere on the internet. And I can always answer the question another time too, or just answer you there. On the subject of CDJs, so right now in a lot of the clubs, like I know they're super popular on the West Coast. Like East Coast seems to be more like, I'll bring my controller and my Serato with me. West Coast, it seems to be more like I'm bringing my thumb drive and I'm plugging it into the Pioneers.
Mm-hmm.
The new Man Ray, that's what they have is the Pioneers setups. You can put the thumb drive in. So my opinion, my personal opinion on this is that Pioneer has always been better with their marketing with their build than with their builds. Like I have never really been a fan of Pioneer gear. I've always thought it's good, but it's not so good that they should be charging that much for it. I have really always been a Denon guy. Like I feel like Denon has actually always been like ahead of the curve in terms of research and development. They were the first ones to break out the tabletop style CDJs. I think Technics actually came out with the first motorized platter, or maybe they came out around the same time as the first Denon motorized platters, but the Denon ones were like super easy to use, and the Techniques ones were like really frustrating to DJs. Like they took a little getting used to, let's say that. Like the first time I used those, I was it was like one of those things, like I showed up to a club in Connecticut and they had them in there and I went, oh, that's cool. I haven't had a chance to play on these. And I was like, do you mind if I warm up? And I was like, holy shit. I'm glad I took that like warm up time, because if I had just gone on, I would have been like, what the fuck is up with these things? It's just one of those things where you had to kind of get used to the way it does it, because it didn't have like that, that cue and instant start sort of thing like the Danons do. It was like set up to be like slippery as fuck, like an actual turntable. And it had all the information mounted in the middle, which Pioneer does now. Pioneer just came out with motorized platters on the Rev 1 controller. And that's a big leap for them, because like I said, a lot of the, like the Denon CDJs, I've been using those for years and years and years. I had the 5000s, I got the 3700s or 3500s upstairs, the direct drive ones, and I have loved those for many years. The direct drive Denon CDJs have motors that are similar to this, by the way. Again, they redesigned the magnetic motor, and but they put it in a CDJ. So I actually have those up there, and I could use those to run like phase, for instance. I can run them with the Serato CDs, right? And and they have nice big. Those are 10-inch platters. The other, some of the other models had 7-inch platters. They have nice big platters on a nice fucking magnetic drive. It is a turntable. In fact, you can modify those, like these old Denon CDJs. You can modify them. You put a tone arm on them, and they become an actual turntable, because the motor is a fucking turntable. So you could take one of the 7-inch ones, put an actual tone arm on it, wire it up with the right bits. And modify it into an actual turntable. Like, it has been done. Look it up. It's out there. So nowadays, it's not so much about CDJs as about, is about the thumb drives, right? And you have a couple of different systems out there. You have the Pioneer systems, which is that well, they have their own filing system, and then Denon has their own filing system. So it's kind of like but with most of them at this point, they're media controllers. They're not really CDJs. They're really like the most popular way of doing it is like, I just want to show up with my thumb drive, maybe it's bringing in the computer and running Serato with the installed system. So you might, it's like if they've got the Pioneer decks in there and you want to set up your Serato with it, it's easy to do.
Mm.
But a lot of the DJs in the clubs and stuff nowadays, it's like they just want to bring their thumb drive, analyze it before the club opens, and that's what they're playing off of. And then the decks are linked too, so you only need one thumb drive and both decks can read it or whatever. If you're buying CDJs because you want to play CDs, that almost doesn't exist anymore. I mean, like, you can still get some of the high end models have CD decks in them. Some of the professional level models, I should say, the Pioneer, Denon has one as well. That's a media controller with a CD drive. But let's face it, CDs just aren't really the way that we're doing things anymore. Serato really like changed the game, and the controller setups and that kind of stuff. I've talked a little bit about the controllers, and sort of same thing. Like, I really like me a motorized platter, so like there's kind of like hundreds of controllers out there that I'm not even interested in, and then there's like, the Rain 1 that is basically the replacement of the NS7 III. That's another thing too, is that like all those companies kind of merged into one company. It's all in music now. So like Rain, Newmark, Denon, all of those brands, Akai, what is the French company that made the speakers that they own now? There's a Alto. There's a bunch of companies that are all under the in music brand now. They basically bought up all the other old school companies that were competing against Pioneer. Pioneer is still Pioneer. So it's kind of interesting because stuff like the Rain 12s and the Rain 1, that was all based on R&D that Newmark and Denon did. Like the Newmark was even based off the Denon work. So they're still creating machines that are based on that work that was done 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the R&D that was done back then. The main difference between the high-end Denon machines and the high-end Pioneer machines is that the Denons are fucking built better. That's all I can really say about that. And one last question there from Frantic. Can we squeeze it in?
Yes.
Okay, Les, what is it? What do we got here?
On turntables, do DJs still write their BPM on the records, or do they have them memorized?
Well, it's a little bit of both, Frantic. So, if you're, yeah, I mean, what we usually do is we take the little office dot things, the little sticker dots, and we'll put that on the corner of the record, and the different colors will kind of be related to like tone maybe or genre. And we spin the record, we count along with the watch, with the second hand, we figure out what the tempo of the record is, and we write it down on that little label. What ends up happening, like, I have a head full of memorized tempos because I played for so long, using records and CDs. With the same thing with the CDs, like print out a label and write the tempos all next to the track names and time. When you do that a lot, and of course when you're playing a lot, so you're like pulling stuff out and you're looking for stuff, you start to memorize the tempos. The more that you use them, the more that you memorize it, the more that you're paying attention to it. Like, and I'm going to say, you're like, writing it down is far better than looking at it on the screen. But yeah, what happens is you really start to get ahead for what you have at what tempo, and like you get to a point where, like, with the wedding music and stuff, you could throw any song that you might hear at a wedding at me, and I'll tell you what the tempo is on that song, because I've played it so many hundreds or thousands of times that for me, those are like reference points. It's like if I hear a song that's about the same song as, about the same tempo as Celebration, I know it's 122 beats per minute.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like, and you definitely get to a point when you do a lot of counting. Again, this is that physical thing where you're like, you're watching the second hand go around and you're counting the beats. When you do a lot of counting like that, not relying on the beat counters, which can go awry, especially if it's weird time signatures or syncopated beats. When you're doing it that way, how do I say this? You have more commitment in it. It's like you have more invested in what you've done, and And what happens then is that you start getting good at guessing what the tempo of a record you've never heard is just by listening to it for 15 seconds without actually counting. You just listen to it, yeah, it's roughly 125 beats per minute or so. Like maybe it's 124, maybe it's 126, but that doesn't fucking matter because you're using your ears anyway, remember? Like if you're using your ears, it doesn't matter what the tempo of the record is. It matters if it's close enough that you can get it to mix without fucking up the pitch. So yes, the answer to that, Frantic, is yes. We're still writing stuff on our labels if that's the format that we're using. Obviously, if you're using Serato, you can tap tempo in or use the auto feature, the beat counter, and that'll tell you what it is. As I've said, like, having the visual feedback is useful, but it should be confirming what's in your ear, not directing your mixing.
Mm-hmm.
Your mixing should be in your ears. And yeah, so that's why, like, I talked about this previously. Instead of counting out 60 seconds of beats, I'd count out 15 seconds of beats and then multiply by 4, and it's fucking good enough for club work. Like I said, I'm going to be within a couple of beats per minute. It's like, like I might think it's 128 and it's actually 126, or it's actually 130, but then when I slap it down on the turntable, I go, okay, that's a little fast, and I knock it down. Right? So, what you're looking for is to be kind of, close. Close enough for mixing, close enough for your ears to do the hard work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's driving us right up to time here.
Yes.
So I think what I'm gonna do is ask Diana if she would kindly once again read out the amazing list of upcoming things that we do all the time.
Yes, coming up this Wednesday, March 8 on MTV TV, we have Hanging Raven hosting New Music O'Clock at 5 p.m. Eastern. And then this coming Saturday, we have We Drink and We Spin Spooky Things at 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on DJ Addambomb's channel. And then we have to rush off as soon as we're done here to see a secret show by Charming Disaster.
Oh yeah. So we really should say goodbye and and go warm that up. So thank you all so much for joining us this and so many Sundays. Do join us for the live DJ shows every Saturday night right here. We've got Spooky Spins this week, Retro Rumpus the week after that, mm-hmm. Wicked Party the week after that. It's not the same thing every week. Even get to explore an awful lot of music that way. So come hang out, see what we do. Thank you for supporting. Thank you for subscribing here on Twitch. Thank you for supporting on Patreon. Thank you for supporting MTV TV and all of these other crazy things that we do. And and we love you lots. Have a great Sunday. We'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Mm-hmm. And on that note, I think I'm going to throw it to the theme song. So thanks again.